Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. Training module for the general requirements of the regulation. Disclaimer. This training resource is not legal advice, and should you require assistance in interpreting the legislation or the regulation, please contact your legal advisor. This resource has been created to assist in understanding the legislation and/or regulation, and does not replace the official version of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, Ontario Regulation 191/11, and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2005, AODA. If there is any conflict between this resource, the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, and the AODA, the regulation and the AODA are the final authorities. This resource may be used for non-commercial, not-for-profit purposes only in meeting the requirements of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation 191/11. The general requirements of the IASR. The general requirements of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, IASR, apply to all the standards of the regulation. Let's start by watching the introductory video on the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. When something is developed for the first time, its design typically reflects the technology advancements or limitations of the time. As time goes on, through a process of rethinking, trial and error, we find improvements that benefit even more people. Improvements that make a thing we've created not only better, but that also make it more useful for us all.
A man in a motorized wheelchair enters a restaurant and moves up to the counter.
To create a province where every person who lives or visits can participate makes good sense for our people, our businesses, and our communities. That's why we're making Ontario accessible to all. How do we do that? We do that by striving to remove barriers. Barriers to accessibility are obstacles that make it difficult, sometimes impossible, for people with disabilities to do the things most of us take for granted. Barriers aren't just physical things, such as steps into a bus or a door without a push-button opener. Information that a person can't easily access or understand can be a barrier. For example, when the print is too small on a brochure for someone with vision loss to read it. Technology, or lack of it, can prevent access. Even everyday information technology, like telephones and computers, can present barriers. Organizational barriers occur when policies, practices, or procedures don't take accessibility into account. Attitudinal barriers are about what we think or assume. For example, assuming someone with a speech impairment can't understand you. Removing barriers doesn't have to be complicated. Mostly, it takes a slight shift in perspective. Approximately 1.85 million people in Ontario have a disability. That's 15.5% of Ontario's population. As the population ages, it's expected that the number of Ontarians with a disability will increase, as will the need for accessibility. In 2005, the Government of Ontario passed the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, also known as the AODA. Its goal is to make Ontario accessible by 2025 by creating and enforcing accessibility standards. These standards are rules that businesses and organizations in Ontario have to follow to identify, remove, and prevent barriers, so that people with disabilities will have more opportunities to participate in everyday life. Standards address key areas of daily living, such as customer service, information and communications, and employment. Several accessibility standards are contained in one regulation under the AODA. It's called the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, also known as the IASR, or simply the regulation. The IASR also includes a section of general requirements that apply to all the standards in the regulation. This regulation is now law, and requirements are being phased in over time to meet the goal of an accessible Ontario by 2025. This gives organizations time to make accessibility a part of their daily business. It's important to note that the standards do not replace requirements established under the Ontario Human Rights Code to accommodate persons with disabilities to the point of undue hardship. They also do not limit obligations under any other legislation. If two laws conflict with one another, the AODA states that the law that provides the higher level of accessibility is the law that must be followed. Compliance deadlines for the requirements vary based on the size and type of an organization, so it's important to know how the regulation defines different types of organizations. The regulation applies to every person or organization that provides goods, services, or facilities to the public or other third parties, and that has at least one employee in Ontario. Organizations are grouped into 5 classes. The Government of Ontario, including every ministry, the Office of the Premier, and the Legislative Assembly, including constituency offices of the members of the Assembly. Large designated public sector organizations with 50 or more employees, including municipalities, hospitals, school boards, colleges and universities, and public transportation organizations. Small designated public sector organizations are those with fewer than 50 employees, such as the Ontario Office of the Fairness Commissioner and some municipalities. Large organizations are those with 50 or more employees in Ontario. This includes private sector organizations such as businesses and not-for-profit organizations. And small organizations are those with 1 to 49 employees in Ontario. In this module, you will learn about the general requirements. This section of the regulation outlines the requirements for accessibility policies, accessibility plans, training for employees and others, procurement processes, and self-service kiosks. Accessibility improvements benefit us all. Accessible buses and exterior paths of travel are not only good for people who use wheelchairs or canes, but help people carrying luggage and parents with strollers. Closed captioning allows both people with hearing loss and a group of friends at a pub to understand what's happening in the game. Accessible documents and websites not only make using a screen reader possible, but also work better on personal handheld devices. Greater accessibility means greater opportunity for Ontario. If we become more inclusive, we really will create a province where every person who lives or visits can participate and contribute to the life of our communities. Doing so makes good sense for our people, our businesses, and our communities. For all of us. About this module. In this module, you will learn about the general requirements of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. This section of the regulation outlines the requirements for who must comply with the regulation, training for employees and others, accessibility policies, accessibility plans, procurement, and self-service kiosks. A glossary of key terms appears at the end of this module. Who must comply with the regulation? The regulation applies to organizations with at least one employee in Ontario and that provide goods, services, or facilities. Under the regulation, businesses and organizations are divided into 5 classes. 1. The Government of Ontario and the Legislative Assembly. 2. Large designated public sector organizations with 50 or more employees. 3. Small designated public sector organizations with 1 to 49 employees. 4. Large private and not-for-profit organizations with 50 or more employees. 5. Small private and not-for-profit organizations with 1 to 49 employees. Your organization's requirements and timelines for compliance depend on which of these classes it falls under. The training requirement. Organizations must provide training on the requirements of the regulation as it relates to a person's duties, and on the Ontario Human Rights Code as it relates to people with disabilities. Training must be provided to all existing and new employees and volunteers, people who participate in developing your organization's policies, other people who provide goods, services, or facilities on behalf of your organization. The training requirement. What it means. Examples of training as it relates to a person's duties. A public relations officer of a municipal transit system may need training on the transportation standard, whereas an administrative assistant may not. A human resources professional or manager may need training on the employment standard, while this may not be necessary for a security guard or accountant. Ongoing training requirements. Organizations are also required to provide training when the organization's accessibility policies change. All organizations, except small organizations, must keep a record of the training provided, including the dates the training took place and the number of individuals trained. Deadlines to provide training. Here are the compliance deadlines to provide training. Government of Ontario and Legislative Assembly must comply by January 1, 2013. Large designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1, 2014. Small designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1, 2015. Large organizations with 50 or more employees must comply by January 1, 2015. Small organizations with 1 to 49 employees must comply by January 1, 2016. Accessibility policies. Organizations must develop accessibility policies describing what they do, or intend to do, to meet the requirements of the regulation. These policies serve as rules that guide your organization's everyday practices. All organizations other than small organizations must also document these policies in writing, make your policies publicly available and in an accessible format on request, include a statement of your organization's commitment to accessibility. Deadlines to develop accessibility policies. Here are the compliance deadlines to develop accessibility policies. Government of Ontario and Legislative Assembly must comply by January 1, 2012. Large designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1, 2013. Small designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1, 2014. Large organizations with 50 or more employees must comply by January 1, 2014. Small organizations with 1 to 49 employees must comply by January 1, 2015. Accessibility plans. Organizations other than small organizations must develop an accessibility plan. An accessibility plan outlines the steps that your organization will take to prevent and remove barriers to accessibility, and how the requirements of the regulation will be met. If you belong to an organization other than a small organization, you must establish, implement, document, and maintain a multi-year accessibility plan. Post the accessibility plan on your website if you have one, and provide the plan in an accessible format on request. Review and update the accessibility plan at least once every 5 years. Accessibility plans. In addition, if you belong to the Government of Ontario, the Legislative Assembly, or a designated public sector organization, you must also establish, review, and update your accessibility plan in consultation with people with disabilities. Prepare an annual status update on your progress in implementing your plan, including steps taken to comply with the requirements of the regulation. Publicly post the status update on your website if you have one, and provide it in an accessible format on request. Barriers to accessibility. Your organization may wish to do an assessment to help better understand its readiness to meet its accessibility requirements. An assessment may help develop an effective plan to prevent and remove barriers to accessibility. It is important to understand barriers to accessibility when developing an organization's accessibility plan. What is a barrier to accessibility? Barriers can prevent a person with a disability from fully participating in society. Some examples of such barriers include information communications, print that is too small to read, attitudinal, assuming that a person who has a speech impairment cannot understand you, technological, a website that does not support screen reading software, policy or practice, a hiring process that does not offer accommodations in interviews. Deadlines to develop an accessibility plan. Here are the compliance deadlines to develop an accessibility plan. Government of Ontario and Legislative Assembly must comply by January 1, 2012. Large designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1, 2013. Small designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1, 2014. Large organizations with 50 or more employees must comply by January 1, 2014. Small organizations with 1 to 49 employees are not required to prepare accessibility plans. Accessibility policies and plans. What's the difference? An accessibility policy states what rules or principles an organization will put in place to support achieving its accessibility goals. Example: our organization will meet the information and communication needs of people with disabilities by providing, upon request, information and communications materials in accessible formats or with communication supports. Accessibility policies and plans. What's the difference? An accessibility plan describes the actions an organization will take to prevent and remove barriers and when it will do so. An accessibility plan is an organization's roadmap for increasing accessibility. That is, the actions that support an organization's commitment to accessibility and its accessibility policies. An example of an action item in an accessibility plan could be a description of how the organization intends to meet the accessible formats and communication supports requirement of the regulation. Knowledge check. Which of the following statements is true about accessibility policies? Choose the best response. A. Accessibility policies identify areas where organization staff will need training. B. Accessibility policies prove that your organization is in compliance. C. Accessibility policies outline how your organization will address any accessibility barriers encountered. D. Accessibility policies describe what your organization is doing or intends to do to meet the requirements of the regulation. Knowledge check. Answer. The correct answer is D. Accessibility policies describe what your organization is doing or intends to do to meet the requirements of the regulation. They serve as rules your organization creates that guide your everyday practices. Procurement. It's also important to incorporate accessibility criteria into procurement and buying practices. Doing so can make a significant impact on preventing new accessibility barriers and addressing existing ones. For example, your organization might set accessibility criteria when procuring new computer software so that it can accommodate the needs of people with vision loss. Procurement requirements. Who must comply? This requirement applies to the Government of Ontario, the Legislative Assembly, and designated public sector organizations, which must incorporate accessibility design, criteria, and features in procurement, except where it is not practicable to do so. For example, when older products and newer ones being procured are technologically incompatible. Provide an explanation, on request, as to why accessibility design, criteria, and features were not practicable to incorporate into the procurement. For example, when accessible goods, services, or facilities are not available. Deadlines for procurement requirements. Here are the compliance deadlines for the procurement requirements. Government of Ontario and Legislative Assembly must comply by January 1st, 2012. Large designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1st, 2013. Small designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1st, 2014. Large and small organizations do not have procurement requirements. Self-service kiosks. A self-service kiosk is an interactive electronic terminal, such as a point-of-sale device you use at a grocery store checkout or to pay for a fare or parking. People with disabilities should be able to use a self-service kiosk as independently and securely as possible. Self-service kiosks, example of a barrier to accessibility. Many organizations have self-service kiosks that use touchscreen technology. Touchscreen technology is difficult or impossible for people with vision loss to use. This technical and structural barrier can have significant impact for people trying to make purchases independently and securely using a touchscreen kiosk. When determining accessibility features to include in the design or purchase of a kiosk, you may want to consider including an alternate, non-visual way to use it, such as a tactile keyboard and audio instructions. Self-service kiosk requirements. Who must comply? The Government of Ontario, the Legislative Assembly, and designated public sector organizations must incorporate accessibility features when designing, procuring, or acquiring self-service kiosks. Large and small organizations shall have regard for people with disabilities when designing, procuring, or acquiring self-service kiosks. This means organizations must consider what accessibility features they could build into their kiosks to best meet the needs of their customers and clients. Deadlines for self-service kiosk requirements. Here are the compliance deadlines for the self-service kiosk requirements. Government of Ontario and Legislative Assembly must comply by January 1st, 2012. Large designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1st, 2013. Small designated public sector organizations must comply by January 1st, 2014. Large organizations with 50 or more employees must comply by January 1st, 2014. Small organizations with 1 to 49 employees must comply by January 1st, 2015. Knowledge check. Which of the following are small organizations required to do? Choose the best response. A. Incorporate accessibility design, criteria, and features when procuring or acquiring goods, services, or facilities, except where it is not practicable to do so. B. Incorporate accessibility features when designing, procuring, or acquiring self-service kiosks. C. Keep a record of the training provided on the standards, including the dates that training took place and the number of individuals trained. D. Have regard for people with disabilities when designing, procuring, or acquiring self-service kiosks. Knowledge check. Answer. The correct answer is D. Small organizations are required to have regard for people with disabilities when designing, procuring, or acquiring self-service kiosks. The government understands that smaller organizations may not have the resources or capacity to meet certain requirements. This is the best answer. Summary. You have now completed the General Requirements module.